Good afternoon. Today is October 26, 2018. We are on the record at 1:18 p.m. This is the video deposition of Bradley Field of the City of Houston, Texas, in the matter of Elder Flores versus the City of Houston, Texas et al. In the United States District Court of the Southern District of Texas. This deposition is being held at 900 Bagby Street on the 3rd floor in Houston, Texas, zip code 77002. My name is Ben Harwood, and I'm the videographer present on behalf of Stratus Legal. The court reporter is Rebecca Earhart, also present on behalf of Stratus Legal. Will counsel please state their appearance and firm affiliation for the record?
U.A. Lewis, the Lewis Law Group, for the plaintiff, Elder Flores.
Jim Butt for the City of Houston defendants, and we'll ask for a read and sign.
Kimberly Clark with Kane Russell Coleman Logan for 2012 Multifamily Real Estate Fund and La Estancia Apartments.
Randall Callanan for the plaintiffs. Plaintiff.
And will the court reporter please swear in the witness? And we may proceed.
Would you raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
I want to just make sure the record is clear that I received some responses to discovery this today before this deposition began for the IA reports, including Brazil, Ventura, Baker, and Payan, and it was presented to me by CD, by the City of Houston, so I have not had the opportunity to review these documents, and I would reserve the right to recall the witness in the event I need to after reviewing these records. And I'm sorry, Mr. Morefield, can you tell me what your, I guess, rank is with the City of Houston, or your position with the City of Houston?
I'm a police lieutenant.
Okay, thank you. I want to address you properly. All right, so Lieutenant Morefield, I'm going to hand you what's marked as Exhibit Number 1, and it's the notice of deposition. Were you able to review the notice of deposition before you came in today?
I was.
Okay, and there were items that you were asked to provide when you arrived. Do you bring any of those items?
I did not.
Okay, and you're aware of what your testimony is to consist of. It's everything, all those topics except for the gang injunction, or excuse me, gang tracker and gang information.
Yes.
Is that your understanding? Okay.
That's my understanding.
Okay. Thank you. All right. And
Counsel, one correction there. I believe the shootings have to be off-duty deadly force incidents rather than all. So I think that was
right.
holding from Judge Rosenthal.
That's true. Not all shootings. It has been narrowed. Okay. Now,
Can you clarify that?
right, so it's not going to be all, you don't have to know about every single shooting by HPD police officers. In this deposition today, the judge has limited it to the scope of this shooting, this type of shooting, I should say, off-duty officers, use of deadly force.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right, so, Officer Morefield, can you state your name for the record?
My name is Bradley A. Morefield.
Okay, and can you spell Bradley for us?
Bradley is Bradley.
Okay. And Morefield, spell that, please.
Morefield is Morefield.
All right, thank you. And how long have you been working for City of Houston?
I've been with the City of Houston for 20 years.
Okay. And have you worked as an officer with the City of Houston for the entire 20 years?
Well, I began as a police cadet,
Okay.
and I was a police cadet for the first 6 months. And then after graduating from the police academy, August 28, 1998, I became a police officer and been a police officer ever since.
Okay. And you stated that now that you are a lieutenant, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you began as a cadet. What other positions have you had leading up to becoming a lieutenant with the Houston Police Department? And I'll just start there. So.
I served at the rank of police officer from August 28, 1998 to April 21, 2006, when I promoted to police sergeant.
Okay.
I held that rank until April 21, 2009, when I promoted to police lieutenant,
Okay.
and have been at that rank ever since.
Great. Okay. Okay. And what departments did you work out of as a cadet?
As a cadet, I was just assigned to the training academy.
Okay. And then so when you came out of the training academy, you became, is it just an officer?
That's correct.
Okay. And I don't mean just an officer, but an officer. Okay. When you were an officer, what division were you assigned to at that time?
I was initially assigned to the Central Division,
Okay. And then?
and after I finished the field training program and completed my 6 months of probation, I then transferred to the Southwest Division.
Okay. And after the how long were you at the Southwest Division?
I was at the Southwest Division until the end of 2005.
Okay. And after you left the Southwest, or were you, sorry, after the Southwest Division, where were you, what division were you?
I transferred to the Legal Services Unit.
Okay. And how long were you at where's the Legal Services located? Is it here?
The Legal Services Unit is located in the HPD headquarters at 1200 Travis.
Okay. And how long were you there in the Legal Services Division?
The first time I transferred there was there from January 1st, 2006 through the time, up until the time I promoted to lieutenant on April 21st, 2009.
Okay.
And pardon me, there was a short stint of being out on the street when I promoted to sergeant, but I was still kind of assigned to legal services, but
Got
then
it.
I did my street time
Okay.
as well.
And when you were assigned to the street, which division would be considered your, I guess, command center?
Sure, so when I promoted to sergeant on April 21st, 2006, I went out to the West Side Division to complete the patrol sergeant training program.
Okay. And after you became a lieutenant, where were you assigned?
When my first assignment as a lieutenant, I actually went back to Southwest Division.
Okay.
I was there for 6 months, and then I transferred back to the Legal Services Unit.
Okay. And what about, are you still with the Legal Services?
No, I transferred from Legal Services of July of 2017.
Okay, and where are you now?
Currently assigned to the Training Academy.
Okay. And was there any place that you were assigned between legal and the training academy?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so no, you didn't go back to the streets anymore
No,
or
ma'am.
anything like that? Okay. And tell me what you do with the training academy currently as a lieutenant.
I am the lieutenant over the Cadet Training Unit and the Field Training Unit. So we are I am responsible for the cadet training program, which is day one of the police academy until they graduate. I'm also responsible for the field training program, which begins the day after they graduate from the police academy, and it concludes about 4 or 5 months later at their respective patrol stations.
Okay. And tell me about this training as it relates to your role, lieutenant. Is it direct contact with the cadets, or just kind of explain that to me, how that works, the training from the lieutenant's capacity?
Sure. I have some contact with the cadets. Obviously not as much as my staff. Between cadet training and field training, I have a staff of 19.
Okay.
And they are more hands-on. I am more of a motivating factor and overseer of the two programs.
Okay. And where is this training located?
The training academy is located at 17,000 Aldine Westfield, just next to George Bush Intercontinental Airport.
Okay. And you said it lasted 6 months, the initial training?
It's just over 26 weeks.
And what does that training encompass?
Well, initially, or the main thing is, we give them what's called the Basic Peace Officer course, which is required by the Licensing Agency of Texas in order to become a police officer. That in and of itself is 643 hours. We add HPD-specific training on top of that to bring our course to right around, pardon me, 1,000 hours of training.
Okay. And you said the HPD specific is how many hours? I'm sorry.
It is roughly 350 hours on top of the basic peace officer course.
Okay. And is there any other additional training for any specialties or anything like that?
What do you mean?
For example, the gang unit. Is there any other type of training that's available to these cadets once they leave and become officers, included in the 350 hours?
Well, so two different questions. You said once they leave the academy, so there are different types of training that are available to police officers.
Okay.
And we call that in-service training. It's sometimes it's mandatory classes, sometimes it's elective classes.
Okay.
And there's, depending on the given year, there's any number of mandatories and electives. It's always at least 40 hours per year. And in the academy, I don't recall right off the top of my head whether there's a portion on gangs or not. I think there is.
Okay. And who is it that, who, I guess, would be the person responsible for choosing the courses that HPD allows after the basic peace officer certification?
Well, ultimately, that would be the chief, but it's also in conjunction with his command staff and the commander of the training division. So it's a group effort of determining what's given to the officers.
Okay. Is there any training in first aid?
There's training, pardon me, there's first aid training during the academy, yes.
Okay. What about any other medical care?
Well, there's CPR.
Okay.
We also give tourniquet training. We also give what's called Narcan training. That might be considered medical.
Okay. And what is
medical
Narcan training?
Narcan is, I don't know if you'd call it a drug. It's a substance used in the medical community if a person is intoxicated on certain types of drugs, and it can be a life-saving measure for that person who's high on drugs.
Kind of like Pulp Fiction?
Yes, I know the scene you're talking about, exactly.
Okay. All right. And as far as the HPD-specific training for the additional hours outside of the basic training, is there any other additional training for medical besides what you've named, what you've detailed?
I cannot think of anything else.
Okay. Now, is this training mandatory or is it elective?
Well,
the three that you detailed.
those are mandatory because it's part of our cadet training program.
Okay. All right. And as far as HPD specific, there's no other medical
Well,
training?
Narcan is HPD specific.
Okay.
That is not a state mandate.
Got it, okay. But is it mandatory within HPD?
Yes.
Okay. And is there any other training that's mandated as it relates to health services or medical training?
Well, health services, we do have wellness classes. We talk about PTSD and other ways in which an officer can maintain wellness throughout their career.
Okay. And Have you had your deposition taken before?
Yes.
Okay. And how many times have you had your deposition taken before?
It's been many years since I've had a deposition, so it's only been one, maybe two. I don't recall if it was one or two.
Okay. And do you know what the deposition cases were about?
It was a car crash. Not that I was involved in, but I did the crash report.
Okay. Did it have to do with HPD?
The city was not a party to the case.
Okay. And you said it's possibly another deposition you've been involved in, but you can't recall whether you have another one or not?
Well, I've taken depositions, but as being the deponent, that's the only one I can remember.
Okay. And what about testified in trial? Have you testified in trial before?
I have.
What about a civil trial?
Not a civil trial, but a civil arbitration.
Okay. And can you explain to me what type of civil arbitration was occurred?
Sure. It was a Chapter 143 employment arbitration where an HPD employee had received discipline, and I was asked to testify as an expert on discipline in the case.
Okay. All right. Now, you mentioned that you've taken depositions.
Yes.
Tell me about how many depositions you've taken.
It's been many years since I had a private practice, so I probably only took one or two depositions.
Okay. And this is while you were in private practice?
Yes.
So you're an attorney?
Yes.
Okay. And when were you licensed in the
Was
state of
li-
Texas?
I was licensed in November 2005.
So as you were an officer?
Yes.
Okay. And so in 2005, when you became licensed, did you worked in private practice, I would take it after that period, I hope, right?
It was a side practice, aside from my HPD employment.
Okay. And what type of area law did you practice?
I did wills, I did some family law, I did some employment law, and a couple of probate cases. Oh, and some personal injury.
Okay. And you no longer have your own private practice, correct?
I no longer actively practice, no.
Okay. Is your license current?
Yes, it is.
All right. Now, well, you know, before I move on, I'm sorry, what school did you attend?
Texas A&M University.
For law school?
For law school, I went to South Texas College of Law.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I should have been, thank you for, you know, you Aggies, I tell you, you have to let it be known, right?
I had to get it in there.
Okay. So, A&M, and then South Texas. Okay. How long did you attend South Texas?
I was a part-timer, so it took 4 years. So from August of 2001 until I graduated in May 2005.
Okay. And in private practice, did you have any discipline by the bar?
No,
Any complaints?
no.
Okay, thank you. All right, and moving on. Can you tell me, as far as the training is concerned with HPD specific, the 350 hours, that takes place 6 months after leaving the academy, correct?
No, that's part of the academy.
Oh, okay. So after the academy, is there additional training by HPD?
Yes,
Okay. Is there any mandatory training by HPD after the academy?
yes.
Tell me about those trainings after the academy that's mandatory from HPD.
So our training year goes from September 1st to August 31st of each year. And so as the department is approaching that September 1st date, the department as a whole is determining what needs to be taught in the upcoming training year. And the state mandate is that over 2 years, a police officer gets 40 hours of training. We double that. We do 40 hours per training year.
Okay. And those hours, are they, how many, excuse me, of those 40 hours of training, what is the mandatory training courses within those 40 hours of courses?
So the mandatory courses, if you're looking for specifics, they change from year to year.
Okay.
So this year's mandatories will be different than last year's mandatories, unless there's a mandatory that has to be given over a 2-year period.
So an officer that, say, works in 2016 that had to take a mandatory training might be different from an officer that's only worked in 2017. That mandatory training might be different for that officer that started working in 2017.
So eventually they'll get the same training,
Okay.
but if it's a training that, let's say it has to be a small class size, and it may take a 2-year period to put the entire department through that training, but all officers will eventually get the same training.
Okay, got you. Thank you.
But let me qualify that by saying all officers may get the same training. There's different training sometimes for supervisors.
Okay. All right. Can you give me some examples of the mandatory training that's required by HPD for its officers that you offer or require?
Sure. So one of the mandatories this year, it's a couple different subjects. One of the main subjects is human trafficking and the issues surrounding human trafficking put on by the Vice Division. That's one of our mandatories. We have another mandatory about the transgender population here in the city. And another example would be last year we had one called Response to Resistance. And so those are just some examples.
Okay. Is there any training as it relates to use of force that's mandatory?
Yes.
Okay. And is that currently on the mandatory list?
That would be last year's Response to Resistance.
Okay, so when you're saying response to resistance, that's including use of force?
Yes.
Okay. And how long is that training?
That was an 8-hour course.
And tell me about that training. Tell me what it all entails.
So the first 4 hours, the morning period, was in the classroom, being reminded of use of force law and some things that police officers should be reminded of when it comes to use of force and dealing with citizens. And then the afternoon session was actually in the gym, putting those concepts actually into action, doing what we call box drills. And it's putting police officers into scenarios where they have to make quick decisions as to whether do I use verbal commands, do I use my baton, is this a deadly force situation, those types of situations.
Okay. And have you gone through this training yourself?
I have.
Okay. And tell me about the box drills. And I know you just kind of explained it. Is that a simulator, or how does that work?
So we have live actors, police officers who work in our gym, who run the scenarios, and they may be actors, they may be observers running the drill.
Okay.
And basically you set mats, gym mats, up in a way that you sort of create a room that a police officer goes into, and then they're presented with a situation where they have to quickly make a decision on response to resistance.
Okay. And are these classes graded at all? Like, is there some sort of grade?
No.
Pass, fail, or anything like that?
No.
Okay. So what happens if an officer doesn't seem to understand or is not doing well in the training? What's the response to that?
Sure. So that's the reason for our defensive tactics instructors to be observers, is to ensure that the police officers are making the correct decisions. And if they see an officer that has an issue, they will pull them to the side and give them additional training.
Okay. So additional training is offered to those that may not be living up to the standard that you expect in this training. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a test or anything that occurs after the training?
I do not recall. I want to say there was a test, but I could be wrong on that. I just don't remember.
Do you know if it's a written test or would it be a verbal oral test?
If it was a test, it was written.
Okay. Okay, and tell me about the training itself. What type of use of force does this training address?
Well, it addresses all use of force. It addresses that an officer should make a reasonable decision when it comes to the use of force, that officer's decision has to be measured with what the suspect's resistance is.
Okay. Are they given a definition of resistance and what that means, the officers?
For that particular course,
Yes.
I don't remember.
Okay. This training, is it, who is it that conducts the training? I'm sorry, I think you said it was about 18 individuals, is that right?
Oh, I don't know how many it takes to run, but the classroom session is taught by what we call the Patrol Tactics Unit.
Okay.
And the afternoon practical is run by the Defensive Tactics Unit.
Okay. Is there any training material that they use to train officers that take these courses?
Yes.
Okay. And tell me about the training material. Is that a paper form? Is it a computer module form? How is that that training material provided?
So every course that we give is going to be backed by a lesson plan. And I do recall that this course also had a PowerPoint that went along with it.
Okay. And is there any training on what to do, what an officer should do after the use of force? The very first, I guess, the steps that they need to take after the use of force has been found necessary by the officers.
In this particular course?
Yes.
I don't recall if that was covered in this particular course.
Okay. Is there any course that you, or any type of training that you will provide the officers on what to do the moment that use of force is necessary?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me about that, those steps?
Well, it's obviously going to be highly variable depending on the facts, but just speaking very generally, if you're talking about a use of force, once you have used use of force, and I'm assuming your question has to do with once the suspect is in custody?
No, I'm not. Just generally, if the officer uses force, and I don't know if that would be the next step, is to put them in custody. So I want all the steps.
Oh, okay.
Would be next.
Well, if an officer uses force, they have to continually reassess whether there's a need for a continued use of force. That's the very first thing that a police officer has to do.
Okay.
And again, highly based on the facts that we're talking about, but if we're going to assume that the use of force and use of force is utilized and the suspect complies, then the next thing to do would be to take the suspect into custody in order to put a pause button on the situation.
Okay. And when you say custody, explain to me what you mean by custody.
So what I'm thinking is a situation where an officer is able to handcuff a suspect.
Okay. Is this the case even when an individual might be injured as a result of the use of force?
Well, depending on the injury, I mean, if there are injuries to the arms that prevent handcuffing, then that might be a special situation
Okay.
where an officer cannot handcuff the suspect. But otherwise, yes, we do expect, for the safety of the officer, for the safety of the suspect, for the safety of any third parties that may be present, we want the officer to handcuff the suspect.
Okay. And are the officers trained to handcuff the suspect after the use of deadly force? If there's no injuries to the arm or anything preventing them from handcuffing the officer? I mean, excuse me, the individual?
Yes.
Okay. So that is required by the officer, correct?
Well, that is trained.
Okay, I'm sorry, trained. And if the individual, is there any assessment to utilize to determine whether the individual is a continuing threat?
Say your question again?
Is there any sort of assessment to understand if that the officer should use, I should say, to assess whether the individual that they use the force on is a continuing threat?
Sure. We teach U.S. Supreme Court law, which requires a police officer to continually assess whether there is a need for force. And once that need is over, the force will stop.
Okay, and I understand that, but I'm asking about the continuing threat. Is there any sort of training to have these officers, to have them reassess whether there's a continuing threat by these individuals that the use of force was
I'm going to object to asking.
applied to? You can answer.
That's what I was saying. You have to continually assess whether there's a need.
You said the need for use of force, and I just want to clarify. I'm not saying the need for use of force. I'm asking for a continuing threat by the individual.
So how do you define a continuing threat?
That's what I would have to understand from you. If you train your officers to understand what a continuing threat is. So whatever the reason, because I'm going to make the leap that the officer only used the force because there was a threat involved, correct?
It depends on what you mean by threat.
Okay. I mean, based on a threat to the officer's safety or somebody else's safety.
Well, if the suspect's actions are dangerous to the officer, dangerous to a third party, and the officer is using force
Yes.
as a matter of self-defense or defense of a third party,
Mm-hmm.
then the officer must continually assess whether that force is needed depending on the suspect's actions.
Okay, and I appreciate that, and I understand that response, but I'm not asking whether the continuing use of force is necessary. I asked about whether the officer has to evaluate whether the threat is, to make it easier, still gone, or is it still present before they take the person into custody.
Well, again,
I'm going to object to asked and answered again. I think he's explained it several times.
Have your objection. He's answering the wrong question, that's why I have to continue to ask this.
no, I think I have the right answer to the right question, which is inherent in the continual need to assess whether there's a need for force is you take the suspect's actions into account. And you have to, an officer has to weigh the suspect's actions against whether there is a need for force at that time.
Okay. I'm still not asking about additional force. I'm not asking that at all. I just want to be clear. So when your response talks about force, that's the reason why I have to re-ask the question in a different way, because it's not the answer I'm looking for. I understand and I get what you're saying as it relates to the use of force, but my question is relating to taking a person into custody, that use of force was required by the officer, or the officer feels that the use of force was required. Does the officer have to assess whether this person is a continuing threat? Is that part of their training?
And I'm still going to object. I think he's answered the question several times.
I have your objection. I don't think you get to have the sidebar.
I do get to speak. He's answered the question several times. I think the problem is that you're not getting the answer that you want. So
No,
I'm going to ask that you move on to the next question.
Can you please respond to the question if you understand the question that I'm
Can you
asking
repeat the question?
Do you mind repeating the question so we're clear on the question that I asked? Because I've asked it in different ways.
Okay, I'm still not asking about additional force. I'm not asking that at all. I just want to be clear. So when your response talks about force, that's the reason why I have to re-ask the question in a different way, because it's not the answer I'm looking for. I understand and I get what you're saying as it relates to the use of force, but my question is relating to taking a person into custody. That use of force was required by the officer, or the officer feels use of force was required. Does the officer have to assess whether this person is a continuing threat? Is that part of their training?
Well, you use the term continuing threat, and that is not a term we use, so I'm trying to
Okay.
determine what that means.
Okay. So officers not trained on what a continuing threat is what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that that is not the terminology that comes out of Supreme Court case law, so that particular term is not something that we would teach.
Okay, fair enough.
That would be your terminology, not ours.
I understand. It's fair enough. So the reason, the point of my question about that is taking the individual into custody. If they're not a threat to the officer, are they trained, are the officers trained to put a person into handcuffs, although they're not a threat to the officer?
So, going back to your use of the word threat. Threat presupposes that the officer knows what the suspect is about to do, okay? So you're asking the officer to look into the future to determine whether the suspect is going to be a threat. We train to handcuff that suspect in order to curb any potential danger to the officer, to other suspects, to third parties who are on the scene.
Okay. So what I call danger, you would better describe as a danger. Excuse me, what I call a threat, you would better describe as a danger.
As a potential.
As a potential threat. Okay. And that's fair enough. That way we can communicate a little better, and I can get to the heart of my question that I'm asking. And so now that I understand the potential danger factor, is that assessed before and while an officer is, before an officer places a person into custody by the means of handcuffs?
I'm sorry, did you say before?
Yes.
Does the officer assess before they place them in custody?
Assess the potential danger before they put handcuffs on them. After the use of force, just to clarify, after the use of force, does the officer assess potential danger before they put handcuffs on the individual?
The officer continually assesses whether there's a potential danger throughout the whole scene.
Okay. All right. And is that a factor in whether a person should be placed into custody in the form of handcuffs?
No, they're
Okay.
going to be placed in handcuffs.
Thank you. I feel like we went all around the world because of my not understanding the potential danger terminology to get there. Thank you. Now, once a person is in custody, after the use of force, is there any training that medical care should be provided to the individual if it's necessary?
No, we're not trained to provide medical care. We're trained to call the professionals,
Okay.
Houston Fire Department.
Is there a reason why there's no training for that type of situation?
Well, I'm not saying there's no training. I think your question was about whether there was training that we have to do something. And what we have to do is call for HFT, call for the professionals.
Okay, so that's the training that the officers are required, correct?
The training is that we're required to do that, yes.
Okay, and when I'm saying the training, we're talking about calling emergency medical providers, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Is that the... And if an officer were to provide additional training, additional aid as a medical provider is on the way, what is the city's response to that? Is that encouraged or discouraged?
The city's response, who are you speaking of?
HPD, when I say HPD, when I say the city.
It is encouraged but not required.
Okay. And is this medical care that your officers could provide an individual they use force on? Is that medical care? Strike that. I'm sorry. Are there other situations where that your officers can be required to use their medical training or first aid besides use of force situations?
So I should have asked you, what do you mean by medical care? We wanna
First
make sure-
aid. Yeah, I'll say first aid.
Okay. And so other situations where I'm sorry, ask that part again?
Is there any training where your officers may require to employ their first aid training outside of the use of force scenarios with individuals?
Requirement, no.
Okay. And what about encouraged?
I mean, an officer has the latitude to do so.
Okay. So, for example, there's emergency situation at a school where let's say it's a shooting that's been going on a lot. An officer is not required to provide any health care or medical care to any students that they find wounded at a school that might have been engaged, where an active shooter might have been engaged there, correct?
Generally, no, but it's highly factual, depending on the situation. It could be an active shooter scene where that police officer needs to act as a police officer and protect instead of taking some type of first aid care.
Okay. But is that first aid care, it's not required though, correct?
No.
Okay. All right, and tell me about the internal affairs investigation. I'm sorry, let me back up. What is your role in internal affairs investigations?
So when I was in the legal services unit, I had the role of reviewing internal affairs investigations as an attorney for the Houston Police Department.
Okay. How many attorneys are in the Houston Police Department?
Currently, I don't know the exact number. If you're talking civilians and police officers, probably around 18 or 20. Not all that work in the legal services unit.
That was my next question, thank you. Okay. So some of them are officers that continue to work in their officer capacity but happen to be attorneys?
Like myself, I'm no longer in legal, but I'm still an attorney. Now I'm at the
Exactly.
academy.
Okay, thank you. All right. How many work in legal?
They are down to, let's see, probably about maybe 9 or 10 attorneys. I don't know the exact number.
Okay. Now, after the use of force, are the officers encouraged to contact these individuals in legal?
That's not our process.
Okay. What is the process after the use of force? We kind of stepped away from that, but we talked about placing the individual into custody. That was the next step, and maybe putting handcuffs on them if their arms are able to be handcuffed.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step after that?
You said after they're handcuffed?
Right.
Well, again, speaking very generally, because it's going to be determined by the facts of the scene, but there could be additional suspects that you're still trying to take into custody. There could be other potentially dangerous individuals on the scene, so the officer will have to remain aware of those. An officer may even have to go and pursue someone else. It's very difficult to answer it in a general way.
Okay. Let's say that the scene is secure. with the officers there, and the individuals in handcuffs, would the next move be to put them in a squad car?
Well, once I take a suspect into custody, I want to make sure and see if they have any injuries on them, because I want to get them medical attention if they have any injuries.
Okay. And then once it's assessed whether the individual has any injuries or not, what will be the next step after that?
Again, highly dependent on the scene. I mean, there may be witnesses to interview, all depending on the facts at the scene. That suspect may stay in place, or you may move them to a car, or you may move them to a room. Just depends on what the setting is, what the circumstances are, how close the witnesses and the complainant are to the suspect proximity-wise. Do you need to move the suspect further away? There's just so many different things that can happen depending on the scene.
Okay. All right. How are we on the tape?
We are 45 minutes, ma'am.
Okay. All right, so the one second. Now, as far as this particular case, Mr. Flores was handcuffed. Are you familiar with the facts of this case?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So he was handcuffed after there was use of force.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm sorry, that was your understanding, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so that's what these officers were trained to do, was to handcuff him after the use of force, correct?
Yes.
And then call emergency services, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And not to administer any aid, correct?
Well, no, I didn't say they were trained not to administer aid.
I'm sorry. They were not required to administer aid, correct?
They were trained that they were required to call for EMS services, to call for the professionals.
Okay. So outside of the training to call the professionals, they were not required to perform any aid themselves on the person, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And with this case, with Mr. Flores, after he was taken into custody in the form of handcuffs, there were other officers that arrived on the scene. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And those officers were a part of what department?
Well, the Houston Police Department.
Okay. And division, I'm sorry, what specific division?
I believe they were the South Gessner Division,
Okay.
the local patrol division.
Okay. And what unit?
Their unit numbers?
No, the unit. What unit were they a part of? Were they internal affairs? Were they gang unit?
Well, I think maybe are you talking about all the people that came later on?
Right, so I could have the
Okay, so
So I'd
The
like to object to that,
terminology-
'cause I don't think this witness is a fact witness for these events. He's testifying as to an expert for the police department policies and procedures.
No, I
Not
don't-
about what
that's
happened
not-
at the incident.
Okay, you can answer. This is not an expert deposition.
It's an expert deposition on policies, not on what happened that night.
No, it's not.
I want to,
But if you know, Lieutenant, you can answer.
well, let me just speak from a general matter, because I want to make sure you didn't misunderstand my prior answer.
Okay.
When I said South Gessner officers arrived, that would be the initial officers that responded to the assist the officer call. Any other investigators or whatnot would have come at a later time.
Okay. And those investigators, what are the units that they're, tell me how would I describe their units? That they're, or division or their department that they belong to?
Well, several different, and again, speaking generally, because I don't know exactly who came out on this particular shooting.
Okay.
But speaking generally, when there's an officer-involved shooting, you're going to have members of the Harris County District Attorney's Office, members of HPD's Homicide Division, HPD's Internal Affairs Division, HPD command staff, and those are the units I can think of I can't think of any other HPD units.
And those individuals collectively, is that unit has a term for it, doesn't it?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. Isn't it called the shot team or shoot team?
I've heard the term shoot team, but I don't know that that's a formalized team. I always took it as that is a generalized expression for all the people who show up
Okay.
for a shooting.
Okay. And so, and those are just the individuals that you kind of named off, correct?
Well, those are the different units that are called to respond.
Okay. And is there anybody in, I didn't hear you mention anybody from Houston Legal. Would they be included in?
From the in-house HPD legal?
Correct.
No.
Okay. And what about outside of the HPD Houston Legal?
When you say outside, what do you mean?
Any other Houston Police Department attorneys that would show up on the scene?
Unless one of the command staff members ended up, they just happened to be an attorney and was on the scene, but they wouldn't be there in the role of an attorney.
Okay. Is there an individual set of attorneys that are tasked to show up on the scene of any of these type of shootings?
Tasked?
It's
For
a job.
some officers, yes.
Okay, some attorneys?
No, for some officers, there is a set of attorneys who are tasked to go out.
Okay. And who are these attorneys?
Attorneys from the Houston Police Officers Union.
Okay. All right. And does the city of Houston have any type of communication requirement with the Houston Police Union?
And ask your question again?
I'm sorry. Does the city of Houston have any type of communication requirements with the Houston Police Department Union as it relates to the shootings, any of these type of shootings?
A communication requirement for whom?
Between the city and the union.
There's no requirement.
Okay. So within the contract between the city and the union, there's nothing in there that requires that the union be contacted in the event that there's any type of deadly force or use of force?
No.
Okay, thank you. All right. How is the union contacted after these type of shootings? Does the city contact or the HPD contact the union after these type of shootings?
Generally, either the officer involved in the shooting or one of the officers who comes to the scene will call the union and inform them of the officer-involved shooting.
Okay. Is there any I don't want to say requirement, but is there any prohibition to the officers calling the union after this type of shooting while there's an investigation going on?
I don't understand your question.
So is there any policy within the city that says you cannot call any third parties, including the union, while this type of investigation is ongoing on the scene?
No, an officer is entitled to have counsel
Okay.
at the scene.
Okay. So is the scene investigation considered a crime scene?
When you say scene investigation, what part of it are you talking about?
Well, there's an investigation at the scene, correct, whenever something like this occurs?
Yes,
Okay. Is it ever considered a crime investigation?
absolutely.
Okay. And who is the suspect usually?
Well, we don't always name a suspect, but because that would be jumping to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, but we we will consider all the actions of the parties on the scene.
Okay.
And therefore, the actions of the officers will be evaluated to ensure that they were lawful and proper.
Okay. And tell me, how are those steps, are those measures taken to make sure that the officers' steps were taken and within the law?
It's a very broad question because you have a lot of units involved and you have many, many, many steps in the process. But I can just speak generally.
Okay.
We talked about the units that come out to the scene, and the homicide division is going to do a criminal investigation on the officer-involved shooting. The Internal Affairs Division is going to conduct an administrative investigation to determine whether there are any policy violations and whether any criminal statute should be administratively cited against the officer. And those are two separate investigations. And then, of course, the district attorney's office may conduct their own investigation. So there are lots of moving parts to your question.
Okay. And from in 2015, how many of these type of investigations occurred in 2015?
Oh, I don't have those numbers in front of me.
Okay. Do you know how many have, approximately how many of these type of investigations occurred in 2015?
I don't want to even hazard a guess.
Okay. What about any, you said that there's an investigation to see if there's any policy violations, correct?
That's correct.
Has there ever been any policy violations found in an investigation of this nature?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, how many?
There's at least 5.
Okay. Can you tell me the 5?
I don't recall the names off the top of my head.
And when these 5 violations occur?
During the period covered in the deposition notice.
Okay. So in the past 10 years?
I thought there was a 5-year period.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, it's actually 8 years. Oh, it is 5 years. I apologize. It does stop at December 2015. So, do you just know there's been 5 violations in that time frame?
Well, 5 cases of violations. There may be multiple violations within each case.
Okay, but you don't know those cases.
Vaguely, some of them, but yeah, maybe.
Okay. Where can we find these cases?
I don't know if it's a part of the discovery in the case.
I don't think it is. Now I'm looking at the second.
Yeah, but
notice.
so
that's outside the scope.
My question
so
is.
my objection would be that the question is outside the scope.
My question is how are we able to find these 5 cases that you've indicated where there has been policy violations?
Well, I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but I'm sure you have ways to get that information.
It's called a deposition that you're sitting in right now, and I'm asking you the question. So without telling me how to do my job, I would just simply ask you to put your lawyer hat to the side for a moment and give me a chance to do my job as you stated and respond to the question, which is simply, if you don't know that information that you've indicated there were 5 instances of policy violations, if you don't know that today, even though you're here for that, where can we find that information?
And I'm going to object to the form of Ms. Lewis's question and the badgering nature of it. I'm also going to object to the fact that it's outside the scope of the deposition notice.
It's not.
I don't know how to answer your question, ma'am.
Okay. Were there any discipline as a result of these 5 policy violations?
Yes.
Okay. And what was the discipline?
The one that comes to mind is Officer Coronado, who received, he was either a 20 or 30-day suspension.
Okay. And what about any other discipline?
I don't know of the other cases, whether there was discipline.
So we know of one instance of discipline, and that would be Officer Coronado, correct?
There could be more.
Okay. And again, how can we find that out since you don't know that here today?
Objection asked and answered.
I don't know how to answer that for you.
What do you mean you don't know how to answer that?
I don't know where to tell you to find that.
Okay. But you were aware that you do have the deposition notice, correct?
I do.
Okay. And I'm sure your attorneys advise you that these are the topics that you're expected to be able to respond to these questions on these topics, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But you're telling me now that you're not able to do that, and you're not able to tell me how we can find that information, because I don't expect you to be a robot. I don't expect you to have all these statistics in your head right now. And if you didn't bring anything to help you refresh your memory, or it's not available, I understand that. But it still is information that we need. So I'm just simply asking you, is there a way that we can find this information since you're not expected to commit it to memory?
And I'm going to object to the form and the badgering nature of that question again, and also to the fact that that question was asked and answered.
Okay.
I don't know at this time how to answer that question.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So we have one officer that you're indicating has been disciplined, as far as you know, that you can recall within this time frame from January 2010 till December 2015, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And could there be others?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know about how many others?
I do not know.
Why was Officer Coronado given 20 days, you said it was a suspension?
That's correct.
Okay. Why was 20-day suspension given to Officer Coronado?
So he was involved in a shooting, and he was off duty, and he had been drinking, and he had his off-duty weapon on him, and he was breaking up an altercation where he believed that a gentleman was getting beat up, and when he tried to break up the altercation, 2 gentlemen turned on him, the 2 that were committing the assault on this other man, and he felt as if he needed to use deadly force to repel their attack.
So, why was he disciplined for that?
Well, he had alcohol on board when he engaged in the shooting, and police officers cannot take police action when they've been drinking.
Okay. So the reason why he received the discipline was not because of the shooting, it was because he took police action while drinking, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And Officer, do you know of any other instances of improper use of force by a off-duty Houston Police Department officer?
You said off-duty use of force?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, there's another one that comes to mind. I wish I could remember the officer's name, and this was a couple years back, where he got into an altercation with his neighbor, and he pulled out his gun and he shot his neighbor.
Okay. And that's what you consider unreasonable use of force?
Yes,
Okay. And is that the only other time that you can think of?
only other time I can think of right now, yes.
Okay. And what was the discipline for that officer?
He was actually going to be indefinitely suspended, terminated, but he resigned before the department terminated him.
Okay. So he was given an opportunity to resign first?
Well, officers can resign at any time. So I don't know if it's fair to say he was given the opportunity. He just resigned.
Okay. What was the delay in disciplining him?
There was no delay.
Okay. You did state that he was going to be suspended indefinitely, terminated, correct?
Yes.
What was delay in actually going forward on that action before he decided to, I guess, resign?
Sure. Well, there wasn't a delay. Under the civil service statutes, it generally takes up to 180 days from the time that the incident occurs to actually indefinitely suspend a police officer. And so just before the paperwork was going to be done, to indefinitely suspend him, he resigned.
Okay. So it takes 180 days to complete the paperwork? I'm just not clear on that. Can you clarify that for me?
Sure. So under the civil service law that's set out in the Texas Local Government Code, which applies to Houston police officers, from the time an incident occurs, generally speaking, the Houston Police Department has 180 days from that date of incident to assess discipline on that police officer.
Okay.
We want to do a good job with the internal affairs investigation. Depending on the complexity of the investigation, that investigation could take anywhere from a few weeks to several months.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the investigation, it goes into the discipline process. And because each officer is going to get their due process and fair play throughout that discipline process, that alone could take several weeks as well. And so the process itself is set up to take a while.
I understand. Okay. And so during that period of the assessment, I guess, and going through discipline, what stage were you at when the officer decided to resign?
That may be attorney-client privileged information, and so I don't know that I can disclose that because I was acting on behalf as a lawyer for the Houston Police Department at the time.
You were acting as a lawyer on behalf of?
The Houston Police Department.
Okay. So you're saying that the Houston Police Department has attorney-client privilege as it relates to the stage of the disciplinary actions and this person resigning? That's privileged information is what you're stating?
That's what I'm concerned about, releasing any attorney privileged information.
I don't think that can be considered just finding out the stage that the Houston Police Department was in at the time this person decided to resign.
Well, it was before the paperwork, as I stated, it was before the paperwork was completed.
What day was it on of the 180th day?
Oh,
80
that I
days.
don't remember.
Okay. What day did he resign?
That I don't remember.
Okay. And what was his name?
As I stated
Oh,
before,
I'm
I wish I
sorry.
could remember.
Yeah, okay.
Loosemore, I think his name was Loosemore, Officer Loosemore.
Okay. I remember, yeah. Okay, so is that 180-day rule that you have to wait before you can, you have to go through all the due process and so forth for the officer, is that a rule through contract or is that through the statute?
It's not that you have to wait 180 days. You have to complete the process within the 180 days. And that is in subchapter G of Chapter 143 of the Texas Local Government Code. And then there are some minor tweaks within the meet and confer between the city and the union.
Okay. So 143G, okay. And the meet and confer, does that requires that the officer be given this 100, well, everything be done within the 180 days? What happens if you go over the 180 days? Is that part of the tweaking?
Well, to your first question, is that, what's the first part you said again? I'm sorry.
No, let me just strike that. So the 180 days that you are given to come up with the discipline, is that a part of, if you go over that, would that be a part of the tweaking within the contract? The meeting confer contract with you and the union?
And I'm going to object as to outside the scope, as the meet and confer contract is not part of this witness's deposition notice.
You can answer.
As I recall, just in a very small part that has to do with if a officer has committed a felony or crime of moral turpitude and the chief is considering a definite suspension, there is a tweak in the meet and confer that has to do with going past 180 days. I don't have the contract in front of
I
me,
understand.
otherwise that would help.
Okay, and what other minor tweaks were hammered out with the meet and confer communication between the union and the City of Houston that is not a part of the Government Code 143?
And I'm going to
There-
object again, as outside the scope, the meet and confer is not part of the deposition notice.
You can answer.
There are no provisions about communications other than, the only thing that I could consider a communication would have to do with if a discipline offer is conveyed from the chief, the officer, and of course it's implied that counsel would be involved. That's where the communication would be, that the officer has up to 5 days to consider that offer. That's the only thing I could consider a communication.
Okay, and I said the meet and confer. I said that communication between the officer, the union and the City of Houston. I just asked what other tweaks from the code, I think you said 143 section, well, chapter 143. What other tweaks are included in that meet and confer outside of, different from the code, the 140, section 143?
And I'll restate my objection.
You can answer.
If I had a meet and confer here, it would be very helpful, because then I could point to them, because there are things about the Civil Service Commission, the Labor Relations Board,
Okay.
there are the grievance process. From that standpoint, there's quite a bit that has been tweaked from 143.
Okay. And is that to give the officers more protection or the City of Houston more protection?
Objection, again, outside the scope.
It's hard to generalize. It's meet and confer is a give and take process. So some of it may be beneficial, some of the changes may be beneficial to the officer, some may be beneficial to the city.
Okay. And going on to the, were you involved in the meet and confer between the city and the union?
I was involved in the 2011 meet and confer and the 2015 meet and confer, but not the last one that was just ratified.
Okay. And when was it ratified?
Objection, this is outside the scope of the 26 deposition notice.
Which one are you referring to?
The latest.
Just a matter of a few weeks ago.
Okay. So 2018, recently, okay. All right, and can you tell me about the requirement to be an internal affairs officer in the City of Houston, HPD?
I can just speak generally, because I never worked in the Internal Affairs Division, but I did work with them. But a requirement to be an investigator is to be a sergeant.
Okay.
And to have a when I say a clean IED record or a good complaint history, I don't know the specifics of what they look for, but obviously they're not going to take someone that has serious citations of misconduct in their record.
Okay. And what is the training involved in becoming an IA sergeant?
So it is dependent on the current command structure, but from my time of having interaction with the internal affairs investigators, a lot of it was on the job training. They would work with another investigator, and then from time to time there might be a training class given.
Are there any IA sergeants that have disciplinary backgrounds at all?
Well, if you're speaking of any discipline,
Right.
then I'm sure there may be something as innocuous as a car crash or something like that.
Or, okay, so like a car crash wouldn't be something that would stop you from being on the IA team. What about using using your weapon while acting in the capacity as an officer while being intoxicated, as Officer Coronado did?
I would say that would most likely be a bar for that person to be an internal affairs investigator.
Okay. We're going to break for just a moment.
Sure.
This is the end of media one. The time is 2:35 p.m. and we're off the record.